The impact of COVID-19 continues to be felt in our region of Southern Africa. Human rights activists are concerned that continued lockdowns will have a negative impact on social justice and democratic reform in these countries. The Southern Africa Human Rights Defenders Summit will kick off this week in Maputo, Mozambique. In fact, it starts on Thursday. For more on the summit and its main purpose, I'm joined now by Professor Adriano Nuvunga. He's the director of the Mozambique Center of Democracy and Development, joining us now virtually from Maputo. Professor Nuvunga, good afternoon. Thank you very much for your time. Why did you and your colleagues in the Southern African Defenders Network of Human Rights found it necessary to hold this summit at this stage?
This is really important because we want to reflect about the serious reality and unprecedented risks of persecution that human rights defenders face across the region. This includes arbitrary arrests and detention, torture, enforced disappearances and violent evictions, and so on and so forth. So with this happening, the Southern Africa Human Rights Network is bringing Africans to Maputo to reflect on the ongoing rising inequality and authoritarianism. But particularly, we are here as the regional convening so that we can contemplate creative ways of building solidarity across the region to defend civic space and protect the rights of human rights defenders.
Yeah, in your presentation ahead of this summit on Thursday, you say that some amendments of regulations and laws in parts of Southern Africa have had a chilling effect on human rights. Can you give our viewers some examples? What are these chilling effects?
Indeed, across Southern Africa, we have examples of African nations in Zimbabwe, in Mozambique, look at Eswatini, that are limiting the civic space, that are constraining the exercise of the rights of for association, for freedom of assembly, and this, it affects the daily life of democracy and the possibility of people to freely exercise their democratic franchise. It is indeed against this backdrop that we are convening here in Maputo. It's not only to look at the specific cases of attacks to activists, to the civic space, but more particularly to look at the overall declining and closing democratic space that is orchestrated by most of governments in the region.
Have you noticed any positives at all in the last year, and as you are preparing for this in terms of human rights defense in Southern Africa? Are there no positives?
What we see is really an increasing deterioration of the democratic infrastructure and the infrastructure for human rights defending. The rise of authoritarianism. Look at what's happening here in Mozambique. The killing of human rights defenders ahead of elections, the forced disappearance of journalists who are trying to cover the ongoing violence in northern Cabo Delgado. These are only few telling examples of what is happening across our region. So, unfortunately, we do not have positive cases. And if you look at the statistics and indexes that are done across the region, they will tell you how the space for exercise of rights is declining, and democracy is in a serious situation, and human rights more generally are continuously being violated by those who were entrusted the power and responsibility to protect.
Will you also discuss the issue where there's been allegations, for example, even here in South Africa, of law enforcement agencies going overboard when they were enforcing COVID-19 regulations or COVID-19 restrictions?
Indeed. If you look across the region, in the context of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and the accompanying restrictive lockdown measures that have continued to impact negatively on the work of human rights defenders and have affected the civic space that is much needed for activists to operate. Indeed, most African nations have used the COVID-19 as an excuse to further limit the democratic space and overall democratic infrastructure. Of course, we have seen cases where nations have conducted elections in the context of COVID, but those were exceptions to a norm, that of utilizing the COVID-19 as an excuse even to target those who were trying to work remotely, online. They were subject to severe surveillance by security forces, etc. So this, indeed, is going to be one of the key issues to be looked at.